This podcast is sponsored by Click Playground. This free programming environment lets you explore and test your data-driven app ideas using Click's engine and APIs. The goal? Less query writing and more efficiency with associative indexing. Visit playground.click.com to learn more and see it for yourself.
Welcome to the InfoQ Podcast. I'm your host, Wes Reisz. I get the crazy privilege to talk to some of the most influential leaders in software today as part of my role with QCon, where I chair the QCon software conferences in London, San Francisco, and New York. These podcasts are glimpses into some of those conversations. When I was researching the podcast with today's guest, I ran across something she said after quoting Jeff Patton. She started by quoting Jeff and saying, "You're not here to build software, you're here to change the world." While I absolutely love that, it was what Linda said after that caught my attention. She said, "If this isn't how you feel about what you do every day, you need to find another job." The Linda I refer to is Linda Rising, often called the Queen of Patterns. Linda Rising is extremely well known for her work with design patterns, retrospectives, influencing strategy, agile development, change process, and even how the brain works. On today's podcast, we talk about patterns, how she got started in the field, including experiences like taking a workshop at UPSLA with some of the Gang of Four, all the way through modern patterns that drive change and innovation in modern organizations today. The focus of both InfoQ and QCon is information and news for senior software developers, architects, and leaders who are not just the scouts for driving change and innovation in software, but the people changing the world with their contributions. This podcast is from one of the early pioneers of the patterns vocabulary we almost take for granted today. I, for one, am so glad Linda agreed to join us on today's podcast, but more importantly, I'm so glad that she chose to change the world and share it with us with her work in patterns. I hope you really enjoy this week's podcast. Linda, welcome to the InfoQ Podcast.
Thank you, Wes. It's wonderful to be here with you today.
What are you working on today? What's been your focus? What's keeping you up at night?
Well, what's keeping me up at night is the division in our country. It's not that we're not familiar with divisions. I mean, certainly in software development, those of us who remember the good old days when there used to be a giant wall between developers and testers. And the expression was, when we're done with the code, we just throw it over the wall. And there was a battle because anytime a tester found a problem, they would blame the developer. And of course, you'd think the developers would embrace that, but instead, they would blame the testers for finding any problems in their code. So we know what division is like. We know what walls are like. That's not something new in software. That's not something new in human development. It's the extent, I think, that things have gone so far today. And now what we find is that we can't talk to one another. Well, if we can't talk to one another in an ordinary community sense, how in the world are we going to make sense of how we interact with one another in any other context?
You know, I hear you and I completely agree with you, but as awful as Hurricane Harvey was and is still in Houston area, I've seen a lot of things that have given me encouragement for humanity and our neighbors. This isn't a place where we've forgotten our neighbors. It's something that I find encouragement by the stories of humanity that are coming out of Houston. I find encouragement. It's about helping your neighbors, people driving from Kentucky to get in the water, to get people out. I've seen some beautiful stories there. They give me a lot more hope than what we've been fed over the last 6 months.
Absolutely. I agree. And we have to build on that. But what we also have to do, and what's happened for me, is that, I'm interested in cognitive neuroscience and how your brain works. And so because of all of this political division, I became interested in the science of how we understand one another. And I'm trying to bring in results that were new to me about evidence in making better communication. So that's the thing I've been talking about, is how can we take advantage of research that we might not have known about there's evidence, clear evidence, in how we can do a better job of not only having political divisions be smoother, but also in our work, that these are the same techniques that we would apply in any division.
Just a second ago, you said, we need to do a better job of just talking to people and a community perspective. We're software developers, we're engineers, we're architects. So what can we learn? What patterns come to mind that we can learn from this lack of being able to talk to people as engineers?
Well, there are several patterns from Fearless Change. You know that Mary Lynn Manns and I wrote a couple of books about organizational change, Fearless Change and More Fearless Change. The one that comes to mind is called Fearless. That was how we came up with the title for the first book, was Fearless Change. It's not fearless change, it's fearless. That when we run into people who disagree with us, we typically want to say avoid them. I don't want to talk to that person. We denigrate them. We don't respect them. And we certainly don't have any kind of interaction with them. So the pattern says you don't need to be afraid of that interaction. You need to welcome it. You need to build on it. And the way you do that is by listening. So the underlying research, the evidence that supports that pattern is a lot of evidence from experiments where they tried to convince people by presenting the results of experiments, data. And what they found was that people, once they'd had an idea about how something should be done, were never convinced by facts. And in fact, even in the face of evidence, what they'll do is hold more firmly to the idea they had originally. That's called the confirmation bias. And we all have that. It's one of the worst biases that we have. Once we believe something, then the only thing that we see, the only thing we can read, the only thing we can hear is something that agrees with us. And in fact, the people who are listening to this podcast right now, if there's anything in here they don't like, well, they just ignore it. They'll just skip right over it, or they'll denigrate the speaker by saying, wow, what can she possibly know? Good Lord, this woman must be incredibly old. She's probably 125. She's been doing all this stuff for decades. I don't have to pay any attention to her, so I'll just ignore it.
So how do you break that bias? Knowing that we have this bias, because we all have biases, how do you hit it head on and purposely prevent it?
Well, the first thing you got to realize is there's nothing you can do. You can't do anything about other people. The only person you can affect is yourself. So when you go into any kind of confrontation, whether you're having a discussion about a bug that somebody else fought in your software, or you're having a design discussion with somebody else who doesn't see this architecture in the same way you do, the only way to go into that conversation is with the idea of learning and being open yourself. I have a friend who does international peace negotiations, and he has told me that in the 40-some years that he's been doing this, he said, you never have any trouble getting people to come to the table. He said, it doesn't matter how long this conflict has been going on. Everybody wants to meet with the other side because they think if they can just give facts, if they can just explain their point of view, well, then surely the other side, if they're intelligent, if they're smart people, well, surely they will then understand our point of view. And of course, each side thinks the same thing.
It's the logic you mentioned before, right? If you're logical, then you have to accept this, right?
Yeah. And when they don't, well, then you blame the other side. Well, they must not be as smart as I thought, or they weren't really listening to me because they didn't get it. So my friend said, I have never had anybody say to me, yes, I want to sit down with the people on the other side because I might not have it right. I might not totally understand what's going on here. I might learn something from talking to those other people. I want to be open to hearing what they have to say. He has never heard anybody say that. And that's got to be true not only for peace negotiations, but for design discussions, looking at bugs in software. It doesn't matter what the issue is. If you go into it with the idea of I'll just explain to that other person my point of view, and then they will clearly see, and of course they never do, and we come away even more convinced that we were right, and we don't resolve the difficulty.
Absolutely. You're not a behavioral psychologist. Your background, chemistry, it's math, it's computer science. Where did this focus on change in people come from? Even further back, how did you get started with patterns in the first place?
Well, patterns is easy because I did the same thing everybody else did. We all went to that big giant Uppsala conference. Nobody remembers Uppsala anymore. But it was the big conference. I mean, there were thousands of people there. And I loved going to Uppsala because that's where you got the latest and the greatest, and you got to see all the people who were doing exciting things. And one year there was a tutorial I signed up for. It was called Design Patterns. And I, at the time, considered myself, I was a designer. I had a PhD in computer science. That's what I did. And I thought, well, this really sounds kind of interesting, design patterns. And it was being presented by 4 guys. And, when I went to Uppsala, there were so many people there and people I hadn't seen very often. So I'd spend a lot of time out in the hallway talking to people. And by the time I got into that room, it was full. And people were standing around the edges of the room because the chairs were all gone. And we all sat there or stood there and watched these 4 guys talk about, well, we didn't have any idea. Patterns, I didn't get it.
Was this 95 and the Gang of 4? Is that who we're talking about?
Yes.
Wow.
And I didn't get it. And of course, probably some of it was because I didn't think they were super organized and they had different presentation styles. And the room was so crowded and there wasn't any time for questions. And they kept saying, well, just buy the book. You'll get the book. So at Uppsala was another exciting thing that doesn't happen anymore, that there were so many booths, publishers presented all the new books. That's why we went. We don't do that anymore. So I lined up. I mean, the line for that book went from the exhibit hall all the way out to the street. And we were all so excited. We're going to get this book, people talking to each other in the line, what is this all about? We didn't get it. We didn't understand the power of these things. So it wasn't until I got the book, I took it home, and I began to read it. And something about holding the book. I love books. In fact, there's a connection, I think, between books and patterns. You hold the book in your hand and you go through it. I don't know. So when I got home, I thought, okay, I get this. And I started talking to people on my team. And then the word got out, everybody in the company. We were having these old brown bags, which eventually became a pattern. And I would get up and I would talk about 2 or maybe 3 patterns quickly over lunch and try to say what I thought was exciting about this, because everybody usually in the room, they already knew the patterns. It wasn't like you were giving them some new idea. They knew the idea. It was the idea that we were going to sort of wrap it up and say, here's what this is, and it's called mediator. And now we can talk about it. We can decide whether it's appropriate or not because we knew the side effects. I mean, it was so exciting.
Yeah, it establishes that vocabulary then that conveys so much more meaning than having to grab a whiteboard with drawing out UML for something.
And of course, every now and then you would run into a pattern where people would, kind of say to themselves, oh, wow, I'd never thought of doing it that way. That did happen. But usually the people in the room were pretty experienced and they used these things. They just didn't have a name, a common name. So we're all going to say mediator.
So that's how you got started. Yeah. Well, that's an amazing story. I guess getting the chance to go to one of the OOPSLA workshop from the Gang of Four would definitely get me going with patterns too. That's pretty awesome. In your words, what is a design pattern? What is Linda Reisling's definition of a design pattern?
It's a little package and it's got a tag on it, just like Christmas package. And it says mediator. And when you know what's in that package, you don't have to open it. You can share it with your friends. You can pass it around and everybody else can look at it and say, oh, it's a mediator. I know what that is. And every now and then you'll find somebody who says, I don't know what this is. What are you talking about? And you say, well, okay, open the package. And then they'll see, oh, it's when you run into a specific context. You have what are called forces. These are the trade-offs that you're going to consider. And here's what the solution looks like. And you know the world is not perfect. So you're going to wind up with some new problems. And those problems probably going to have new patterns to address them. So they all work together. It's what's called a pattern language. A pattern is not a Band-Aid that you whip out in a single instance and just apply it. You do it in a context that's typically determined by other patterns, and then it creates a new context where other patterns need to step in. And I don't know if you've ever read any papers by Doug Schmidt, did a lot of work with real-time communications. Those papers that he wrote, it was just like picking up a tangle, a big web, and you'd say, all right, he's talking about this particular pattern, but underneath it, here are 4 or 5 other patterns. And then underneath those, well, here's 4 or 5 other patterns. I mean, it's awesome because that's really the structure. We draw these wonderful diagrams, but that's not what software looks like. It's a tangle. It's a tangle, but it's a tangle where you can make sense out of it if you know the names of those little nodes.
I always talked about it to my students as the vocabulary of software. So once you start to grow your vocabulary in software, you can communicate your intent. You start talking about singletons, people know exactly what you're talking about. So speaking of that, you're talking about the Gang of Four book, the original design pattern book. And that book is organized, I think it was 3 areas around creational patterns, behavioral patterns, and structural patterns. How do you organize patterns? What's the shape, the structure that you give to talking about patterns?
So the answer to that question, which has been batted around forever, is it depends.
That's the consultant answer.
Because what came out of the Gang of Four book was more than just a publication. It was a community. And the people who were involved in that way back when, we just loved hanging out together. And we would have these patterns conferences. It started with one conference at the University of Illinois and grew to, well, it depends on how you count it, but 4 or 5 other patterns conferences. And we patterns people would hang out at these conferences and we would do a little thing called a writer's workshop where we were trying to create more patterns. But we would also discuss these philosophical issues, like the question you just asked. Well, how do you categorize them? How do you know what is a pattern? Often that would come up in the discussion of a paper. We said, is this really a pattern? We love that. We just sort of, it's like a blanket, you'd get in there and roll around in it and have fun discussing it. And we never really came to any conclusions, but one of the Gang of Four guys who I still miss to this day was John Blasides. He worked at IBM. And he had the idea that we were going to try to make a stab at that. And he talked to me at another OOPSLA, and he said, we're going to do something like the Farmer's Almanac, where we're going to try to categorize these patterns. And we might not get it right, but, every year we'll come out with a new version of it. And so I wrote what was called the Pattern Almanac 2000, had a lot of help from John. He was my editor. Awesome, awesome guy. And so many people got involved in that. How do we do this? Do we do it by domain? So we put all the communications patterns, all the architectural patterns, all the fault tolerant, high reliability, organizational.
Never got a final answer, huh?
No, we never got anywhere. And even when we had Christopher Alexander, who came to an Uppsala, gave a keynote at Uppsala, he didn't have a clue. He was interested in talking about architecture. I mean, architecture, building architecture. And his patterns were from large to small. You start with the world and you work your way down to patterns that you use for your backyard garden. That's how he organized them. And people are still struggling with that. I'm going to go to a conference in October called Purple Sock. It's in Vienna, and that's one of the things they're going to talk about. So
So no answer.
We don't want an answer. We just want to keep talking about it.
Keep the discussion going.
And of course, the real question is, people are still writing patterns, of course, but they are right only. We got so many. And at the time the almanac was created, there were well over 1,000. All I put in that book was published patterns. They had to actually have an ISBN number. And so there were still tons and tons of patterns that were just out on somebody's website. And they couldn't be included. That Addison Wesley said, no, that's not good enough. So now there are probably orders of magnitude more patterns. But how do you find them?
Well, what makes a pattern now? Is it just something that you've seen 2-3 times in a code base? Is that a pattern?
So here's my concern. And in fact, for me, it's been a shift that if you know the structure of a pattern, it's supposed to be a solution to a problem in a context. And so when you look at a pattern, you say, okay, what's the context? Where are you? What are the forces? What are the things that you have to consider? What are the trade-offs? And then you outline the solution. Usually if it's a software solution, you can have a diagram or some kind of code example or whatever. And then you say, what's the resulting context? What will I get? What will the world look like if I use this pattern? And then there is a section called known uses. And you have to come up with, and it can't just be your known uses, who has actually taken this solution and applied it successfully. And we stop there. And to my mind, that is not enough. So I'd like to change. In fact, that's going to be my proposal in October. There must be evidence. And I'm talking about scientific evidence. I think that we are making too many decisions these days based on, even in the Agile community where we use the experiment all over the place, we are not doing experiments. We are just trying stuff. An experiment should be a scientific experiment. It's called the scientific method because there's a process in place for doing an experiment, and we're not doing that. There should be the hypothesis. That's your pattern. Okay, I think this really works well for solving. So how are we going to show that? What will be our experiment? And how will we know? How will we measure whether this was successful or not?
That's the way you grow knowledge, right? By proposing a hypothesis, by using the scientific method, you grow knowledge rather than just capturing data.
That's right. Since I've spent a lot of time there lately on the organizational side, on the people side, where a lot of that is a little fluffy, but even on the technical side, think about organizations that are trying to move to Agile. Where is the proof?
Well, okay, I'm glad you started there because that was my next transition that I wanted to make. So let's talk about a certain group of patterns that you might apply. In particular, I am fascinated about you introducing Scrum. I think it was 95, 96 into an organization. I think I told you right before this that in 2010s, I was trying to introduce Scrum to an organization and I felt like a heretic. So I can't imagine 20 years before that what it was like. So first, tell me some stories about that first experience of introducing Scrum into an organization in the 90s.
Well, first of all, let's say that I had an enormous amount of success at that time. And in fact, it changed my life. And it had nothing to do with me. It had really nothing to do with patterns. It had to do with the organization where I worked. That was AG Communication Systems, which no longer exists. And I had had a long career before I got there and had never been part of such an open, really agile organization. I felt encouraged. I felt listened to. I felt that people were open. If I brought in, some weird idea that people would say, well, we can see how that works here. I might not work, but. And it's because of that, not anything I did.
That's the importance of culture, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I would be at a loss to explain that because when I arrived in that organization, that's the way it was. So I'm not sure whether it's always that way. I asked people, I tried to learn about it, but no one could really tell me what had been the path of that organization to get to that point. But that's the secret.
That doesn't help me with patterns to drive change and innovation in your company. But
no, the patterns came out of that experience, but also the experience of others. And I learned from that even within a receptive culture, there are patterns. So I learned because I made mistakes along the way. There were things that didn't work.
What are some patterns that you might suggest when someone's trying to drive change in a company?
Well, the first one would have to be small steps, or later on we called it baby steps. I meet with so many CEOs, high-level executives, and they have a goal. We are going to be agile. We're going to make this huge change by June. And they want a timeline and they want milestones. We're going to do this by that date so we can see it, we can measure it. Well, of course, it's like any kind of estimate. You can give it to them, but it's a lie because you don't have a clue. You don't have any idea how this is all going to play out. And the absolute best thing you can do is very small steps, as small as possible. And you go to the parts of the organization that are receptive, because there's always some little pocket of innovators and earlier. They are open. Start with them. Don't just say, we're going to move the whole organization. First step, we're going to do this. No. Go where the people will listen, are open to experiment.
There was another talk that I watched. I think it was specifically about fearless change, patterns for introducing new ideas, your last book. But you talked about the importance of Slack when you're pushing change, that you need Slack in a company, you need Slack in your own life. Can you talk a bit about Slack and its importance?
For a brief time, because of a lot of things all came together, I worked for a very, very small company. And these people were so smart. In fact, you can correlate the size of the organization with the general intelligence of the people who work there. Sorry, the bigger the organization, the lower the average. And I think that's a self-selection process. And it has to do with visibility, that in a small company, everybody knows exactly what you have accomplished in the last month. There's no way to hide. In a big organization, there's more places to hide. Slack. There's more Slack. So in that small organization, I thought, well, this is great. I know these people. They're all really smart. And so I started with my patterns. I was going to teach them some things about patterns, about Scrum. I was going to do that. Now I said, we'll do it over lunch, brown bag. I know you don't have any time. And it got nowhere. Not that they weren't smart, not that they didn't get it, not that they didn't want to, not that they didn't have open hearts and open minds, is they had no time for anything. No Slack. That's Tom DeMarco's book, by the way, Slack. Where in a larger organization, okay, yeah, the average, whatever you want to call it, intelligence IQ might not be as great, but there's more time there. They have Slack. They could invest a little in learning some new technology, some new tool, some new set of patterns, whatever. They got a little bit of breathing room, a little bit of space. If you don't, it's just not going to happen. And that's true in your own life.
It's my biggest challenge is trying to find Slack and force Slack into my schedule, both in my own personal life and in work. So I completely get it.
See what you just said? You said force Slack.
It is force Slack. I try to force Slack on my Fridays because I've got so much going on.
Force creativity. All right, you got 10 minutes. Be creative.
What do you suggest? You've got to be intentional, right?
That's right. In fact, there's a wonderful book that I just finished reading. I recommend it. It's called Deep Work. And it's about the lack of focus and the lack of space for creativity and innovation in today's workplace because we are buried in the trivial. They've measured the amount of time people spend on email and social media. It's eating us alive. We've got to get out of that. And the only way is to do exactly what you said. And that's what Deep Work recommends, is you have to schedule it. And you say, I am not answering emails, returning phone calls. I'm not getting on social. I'm not going to do any of that except at these times. Otherwise, it'll always be there. Put that phone away.
I think the one that drove me, the last book that I just read about was Talent is Overrated by Jeffrey Colvin. He talked about the importance of making time.
Yes. And in fact, I heard a podcast interview with the author of that book, and he said, you mean you can schedule creativity? And the guy said, yes, inspiration is overrated. We think that happens. No, if you don't have the time for it, if you don't have any space or slack in your life to follow up on that great idea that you have, then it's going to die. So it is a scheduling thing.
Absolutely is. I like just being intentional. I don't know if it came from that book, but the word that I took away was just being intentional about slack and forcing it into your schedule.
Absolutely.
What is your most recent discovered, unearthed pattern that you might talk about?
It's kind of a rediscovery, I guess. I knew it all along. But as I said in the very beginning, so we'll end by going back to the beginning, is that in doing all this research around morality and ethics, can you believe it? If you can do an experiment on morality and ethics, you can do an experiment on anything. So I took all that evidence, I took all of those nice scientific results, and I was trying to apply them by doing exactly the same thing that I always used to do when I was a strictly technical person, which was use them just like facts. Use these new techniques to do battle, to try to convince. Since I understand you better now, so I know you have a certain mindset, so therefore these are the things that you value. So I'm going to come from that place and I'm going to use that to argue you down. And what we're missing, the most important key in communicating, is an old pattern that I wrote way before Fearless Change. It was part of a collection for customer interaction for technical people who had trouble talking to customers. And the pattern was called listen, listen, listen. And that's what it's all about. And yes, the evidence is wonderful. The Moral Tribes is a wonderful new book, and The Righteous Mind is another one by all of these behavioral scientists who are doing experiments. But if you don't take that in the context of the pattern, listen, 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 then you're just going to go into it with the idea of being confrontational instead of being open yourself to change. This is so old. I don't know if you've ever read the book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People.
Of course, Stephen Covey. Absolutely.
You should read it again. He's no longer with us, but yeah, he had a wonderful bit of advice in there. He said, seek to understand, not to be understood. And that's just a different way of saying what the listen, listen, listen pattern is all about. In fact, that's what's more convincing. I can remember having a conversation with a guy once where, he didn't like what I was doing. He didn't like patterns. And all I did was listen. And after a while, he finally said, well, Linda, I guess I could try it. And I thought to myself, what did I do here? I didn't argue him down. I didn't haul out the facts. I listened him. I listened him into agreeing with me. And I have to keep learning that lesson over and over and over. I think there's something in us that just wants to haul out the fencing equipment and go at it and duel back and forth when really we should put down the swords and just listen.
It's all about empathy. Well, Linda, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us on the InfoQ Podcast and giving us the chance to listen to your story, your journey about patterns. It was really an honor to talk to you.
It was my pleasure, Wes. Thank you.